So the last couple days, we took a little bit of a break from going over U.S. history and talked about some uh, geography. So if you were in class the last couple of sessions, you know what I'm talking about. If you weren't and you want to kind of review some basic geography, you can check out the YouTube channel, and the older class videos are stored there, so you can go back and watch that. And you can also go to Cetera.com, which was the website we were using to play some of those map quizzes and various geography games. So again, the last couple days we spent discussing geography, but today we're going to dive back into U.S. history, hopefully finish up this last chunk of U.S. history over the next. Okay. So let me go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint, and while I'm doing that, if you all make sure to sign in the chat to Caleb, make sure you can either just post there or send him a message privately and just let him know that you're in there, and that way we can log our attendance. So let me pull up a couple things. So I'm going to do this in a couple steps. So first, I'm going to pull up, just hopefully you can see this, but I'm going to pull up just the text out of the book, just to make sure I don't forget to mention a couple things, and then I'll go back to my PowerPoint. All right, so today we are picking up where we left off with U.S. history, which was, for those of you that weren't here last week, we're going through U.S. history and basically started from colonialization through the American Revolution all the way up through the Civil War, through the industrial era, and kind of towards the turn of the century. So turn of the century being 1900, so 120 years. All right, so that's kind of where we're picking up. And so the big shift, and we just kind of talked about this right at the end of that section, which is after the Civil War, the United States undergoes this massive industrial boom. And we go from basically being a relatively small country, relatively private country. In other words, we kind of just kept to ourselves as a country. And a relatively agricultural-based country, meaning most of our economy was based on growing stuff. The industrial period totally flipped that around. We had a huge boom in immigrants, and so our population grew immensely. We became a large nation. We started making lots of stuff, selling lots of stuff, shipping lots of stuff internationally. And so with this boom in industry, it also shifted how the United States operated politically on the world stage. So what I mean by that is the United States starts to become world power that we kind of know it as today, right? For good or for bad, right? That's kind of America's role in the world today. Is we're the most kind of recognizable country, and that, again, for good and bad. But we also interject ourselves into a lot of foreign affairs. In other words, global politics, right? And so that wasn't always the case. Prior to this big industrial boom in the 1800s, the United States didn't do anything like that, right? And so this shift starts to affect how we run our country, right? And so business and government leaders wanted and needed more access to natural resources to enable industries to keep growing. They wanted to be able to sell more overseas to Asia, Europe, Africa, Latin America, all these places. And so in order to accomplish those things, and in order to just kind of keep this trend of growing and becoming more and more powerful, the United States starts to become what they term as imperialistic, right? And so what I mean by that is, let me share. So when I'm talking about imperialism, imperialism is essentially the kind of control a nation has over another, right? And so, and there's the definition of it, just to make sure I get it right. The policy by which a stronger nation extends economic, military, and or political control over a weaker nation or region. So it doesn't necessarily mean, the United States was going out and getting more territories to become states. They were just expanding their reach, right? And so that meant setting up military bases. That meant becoming involved in wars and conflicts around the world that didn't necessarily involve the United States, right? So they started becoming involved in other people's affairs, and basically to help extend this American power kind of all over the nation, right? So imperialism wasn't new to this time period. European countries had been practicing this for hundreds of years prior to America finally deciding to join in this kind of practice of extending the power, right? So, sorry to kind of keep bumping around back and forth and back and forth, but I'm going to do it anyway. Okay, so again, by the late 1800s, the United States starts to really be a player globally in terms of a powerful country, right? The first kind of big shift was the United States fighting in the Spanish-American War, and that was basically, and when I talk about wars, I'm going to do my best to really keep things short and sweet. Okay? You don't need to know all of the nitty-gritty details of all of these wars. Okay? As interesting as some of them might be, some people are really interested in, the history of wars. I'm going to just try my best to keep it very simple, not go into too much detail. And if anyone wants me to go into more detail, I can do that in a minute, right? So just let me know. But again, the United States goes to war with Spain, essentially over the mistreatment of Cuba, which at the time was a Spanish colony. Okay? So the United States goes to war with Spain and says, we don't like the way you're treating Cuba. We're going to fight on Cuba's behalf and kick you out of Cuba. So what happens? The United States ultimately wins the war, gains control of the Spanish colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. It didn't grant independence to any of those initially. Eventually, make sure I fact check myself here, but Cuba and the Philippines become their own nations. Puerto Rico and Guam are still U.S. territories. Okay? And the Philippines has lots of U.S. bases left over from this time, right? But initially, right after winning the war, the United States didn't win the war for Cuba and say, all right, Cuba, you're off on your own now, enjoy independence. The United States says, well, we're going to want to treat you better. We're going to keep control of you as a colony or a territory, right? And that was the mindset at the time, was amassing all of these territories in all these different parts of the globe. Okay? So the next kind of chunk of things we're going to talk about, and I have no idea how far we'll actually get in all this, because if I zoom out, and you can kind of see what this one page and this one section talk about: imperialism, World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. I can't talk about all that in 30 minutes, no matter how fast I go. So we're not going to get through that all today. But I want to kind of go through World War I a little bit and kind of hit on the main points of it. Because World War I was really kind of the first major international dispute that the United States becomes involved in. The Spanish-American War is big, but nothing up to the scale of World War I. Okay? So I'm going to first just kind of look through this paragraph and kind of read through it. just so you kind of get an idea, and then I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint and the maps, and so you can kind of visually see some of this stuff, right? I don't want to just sit here and read a paper to you. But 1913 comes around, so now we're 10, 15 years removed from the Spanish-American War, and we'll get into some of the causes of it in just a second, but ultimately what happens was, or what happened, right, is we have allied countries on two sides. Okay? On one side, we refer to them as the Allies, and part of that is because they ultimately are the side that the United States joined, right? The other side is known or referred to as the Central Powers. So the Allies, and I'll pull up a map in a minute, but that's Great Britain, Russia, France, and there's other countries that join the Allies. On the other side, we have the Central Powers, which at the time were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which is present-day Turkey and doesn't exist anymore, right? The Ottoman Empire. Okay, so the Allies and the Central Powers are fighting and fighting and fighting. And then finally, 1917. So it's not for 4 years that the United States joins in after Germany ends up sinking one of our ships. And that's when the United States decides to join in the war. But until then, they stayed at it. Okay, and ultimately, we know the Allies defeat the Central Powers, and World War I comes. Okay, that's World War I in like 1 minute. I'm gonna go over a few more details on it, and then if we have time, we may do 1 or 2 questions today, or we may save some questions for tomorrow. But again, let me a brand new share here. I'm gonna go back to our PowerPoint. Okay, so there's imperialism, right? Now moving on through that, we've got World War I. Okay, so always do this. Getting a happy. All right, so again, some of the things that led to World War I were imperialism to an extent. Right? You have all these countries trying to extend power over these other weaker countries. So that factors into why World War I happens the way it does. Nationalism, kind of the pride of certain nations. Militarism, which is just what it sounds like, which is certain countries wanting to exercise the strength of their various armed forces. And then obviously the alliances, right? So this begins, and not to dull you with details, right? But this essentially begins as, let me make sure I get this right. Dispute between Austria-Hungary on one side and Serbia on the other side. So it begins as just a conflict between two countries. Okay? The Archduke Franz Ferdinand is scheduled to become the next leader of Austria-Hungary and is assassinated by someone from Serbia. So those two countries go to war. And essentially what happens is the allies of Austria-Hungary come to their aid. So Germany and the Ottoman Empire come and say, we'll help you out. Serbia goes to its allies and says, we need help in this battle. And so they kind of pull in these other countries. And then all of a sudden we have the entire continent of Europe all fighting against each other, right? With what started out as a conflict between two countries. So that's what, when I say alliances caused World War I, that's what I'm talking about. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand is essentially the one specific thing that actually launches the events that would become World War I, right? All that other stuff, reasons maybe why it became bigger than it should have, or things that factored in indirectly, but directly speaking, that assassination is what started it. Okay? All right. So I'm going to skip this and come back to it another time, probably tomorrow, and talk about stuff going on in the United States at the time. And just kind of focus our effort on uh, World War One, and then we'll wrap up. Okay. So down here, I want to talk about the two different maps because they look different. So before World War One, the political boundaries or the countries that are made up look different in Europe. Okay, so we have Germany was much, much bigger than it is today. Austria-Hungary is a country that doesn't exist today. Austria does, Hungary does, and then there are other countries in that, like the Czech Republic, Slovakia. There are a few others in there. But anyway, Austria-Hungary is this big country at the time. And then down here, this isn't even so the Ottoman Empire is way down here. So you can barely see it on this other map. That's why I went back. And it's mislabeled as Turkey. But anyway, this is the Ottoman Empire down here. Bulgaria ends up joining. So the pink are the Central Powers. They're on one side. The Allies are the yellow countries, or orange, or whatever color this is. Portugal, France, Italy, UK, Russia, Romania, Serbia, obviously, who's, again, started the war, Albania, and Greece, right? And then ultimately the United States comes in, okay? Now, keeping track of all these specifics isn't important. That's not the point of me going through this, right? Just kind of try to take away some big pictures. So, the map of Europe looks different. There are two sides. Blue, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Spain. They say we're staying out of it. We're going to remain neutral. So they choose not to fight. The others kind of take sides. Ultimately, what happens is, after years of stalemate, the United States comes in, the Allies end up winning the war. What happens after that is essentially this kind of redrawing of Europe. Europe looks remarkably different after World War One than it does prior to World War. So you have the Treaty of Versailles, which ends World War One. Germany is divided up. So notice Germany here, much smaller than it was here. So you have the formation of Poland, which is new, and then these countries up here, East Prussia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, right? So we have some new countries that pop up as a result of Germany being divided up. Germany was not allowed to keep an army or a navy as punishment for their role in the war. Now, even though, again, we said this essentially started as a dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, but it was really the German military that escalated things to the level that it became. And so the Allies, the winning side, viewed Germany as kind of being at fault. Germany was heavily punished. So again, they were not allowed to keep an army or a navy, and that was to keep them at bay or to keep them weaker than other nations. And Germany also had to pay reparations or war debt, right? So Germany had to literally pay other countries for the damage that the war did. And so in hindsight, we can kind of look back and see that some of those things probably weren't great ideas because ultimately that punishment of Germany led to the rise of fascism, Hitler, and then ultimately World War II, right? So, but again, hindsight, we can kind of see that. But at the time, it was just viewed as we needed to punish Germany for their actions in the war, and these felt fair and were agreed upon by everyone, and that's how it ended. The League of Nations was an idea that there would be basically like a peacekeeping body that made up of different countries. The U.S. never actually joined it and tried to remain isolated, and then eventually that idea became the United Nations, which still exists today, and most countries in the world are part of it. And then again, down here, the little blip says World War II and Germany's attempt to make a comeback from economic rule. All right, so again, we won't get into that today. So let me stop here and back up. Questions? Bear with me. Sorry for all this hopping around today. Yeah, so I think we will stop there. I know we have 7 minutes. Let's do some practice questions. And then tomorrow we will talk about the United States at home during this time, some of the things going on there, and then the essentially lead up through the Roaring '20s into the Great Depression, and just see how much of that we get through tomorrow. Let me see. So, for sure we'll do number one. We may, talking to myself. That happens to me every once in a while when I can't hear or see any of you. I apologize. All right, so number one refers to this chart. So the title of the chart says Factors Related to the Growth of Imperialism. And again, remember, imperialism is a stronger nation extending control over a weaker nation. So these are all the different ways, right, that a stronger nation can control a weaker nation. So economically, militarily, politically, religious, or cultural. Okay, and so over here, that's the factor. Here's the explanation. The desire for greater access to natural resources and markets. Economic factors can be a reason why a country wants to extend control over another country. Desire for control of ports that can serve as refueling stations for long sea voyages or air flights. So the reason why Hawaii was sought after, Guam, I'm drawing a blank, but basically like islands in the South Pacific. And the reason why so many of those islands were controlled by other countries was exactly that reason. Because the Pacific Ocean is huge, and it was vital for some of these big, powerful European countries and ultimately America to have ports in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that they could stop at and refuel. Also, they could have military bases in areas that were closer to mainland Asia and other places. So again, the desire for controlling those ports and either having military bases or refueling stations was a military reason why countries wanted to control it. Politically, so a desire to spread the institutions of democracy or other political systems. So a lot of the reasons we try to control other countries is to institute democracy in those countries, right? Or places like Iraq, where the United States stays around and controls the country after a war has been over, hoping to put in place a friendly government to the United States and a similar type of government. Okay, so again, all these things they come back to imperialism. Religiously, right? There are a lot of, and you don't see this so much anymore, but historically, a lot of imperialism goes back to spreading religion, right? Spreading Christianity or whatever faith, right? But you see a lot of countries trying to exert their control religiously, right? And then culturally, just trying to, and it says here, lack of respect for different cultures or races, but it also works both ways. And some of these stronger countries wanting to impose or spread their cultural beliefs or what have you across. All right, so that's kind of a long-winded explanation of the chart. Let's finally look at the question at hand. So Cuba lies about 90 miles off the coast of Florida. After the United States freed Cuba from Spanish rule in 1898, the U.S. Navy built an important base there. Circle the factor in the chart above that best explains the situation in Cuba after 1898. So, kind of an easy question. Basically just looking at which one of these 5 categories does this sound like it fits in? Is it an economic control, military control, political control, religious control, or cultural, racial? In fact, they say Navy and they build a naval base there. Me says it's probably military, right? And then that would be the right answer. So even though Cuba, which was a territory of the United States, was eventually granted its independence, given its freedom, the United States still has a military base on Cuba. So even though Cuba is its own country and it's not a territory of the United States, we still have a military base there. And that goes for lots of other countries around the world. The United States has military bases there, and the reason is to keep a certain amount of control over the world, right? Or to have a presence in lots of different places. All right, so I'm just a couple minutes early, but it's not enough time to dive into a whole new topic, so I'm going to stop just a couple minutes early. If anybody has any questions, now would be the time to fire them up. Otherwise, I will let you off a couple minutes early. Don't forget, if you need help with reading, to check in with Martin's reading class that happens at 12:15 in a half an hour. And I will be back this afternoon for science at 1:15 if anyone needs science help. And don't forget, if you do need math help, Sean has his morning math at 10:15. Just trying to make sure everyone knows the schedule of the classes. This will stay the schedule for kind of the foreseeable future. And for those of you that have been students at NextGen for a while, and remember when we were in the building where we had where I taught an afternoon math class, at some point in the future we will go back to kind of having that extra class and that extra math class. But for now, we just felt like it is most beneficial to just have one offering for every subject, so we'll keep doing that. But anyway, if you do have needs or want help in any of those subjects, make sure you reach out and you ask. All right? So anyway, I will let everyone go. Tune into Martin's reading class, tune into the science class, and I will see everyone later. Have a good one. All right. Bye.